Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Ich, dank, lieber, Herre. We've looked at this particular text before and this particular melody. It's one of the first videos that I actually made on the channel. It translates to, I think, the Savior, dearest. Very interesting introductory chord progression and some interesting chord progressions throughout. All in all, mostly functional, but this introductory chord progression is going to throw us for a bit of a loop, as it did in previous iterations of this particular melody that we've looked at in the past. Let's just hop right into the analysis. So we have three sharps in the key signature. We start on A, we end on A. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is A major, despite our first cadence being a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E major. So we're looking for a point in which we modulate, and I think it's going to happen in and around this D sharp. And I think there are multiple ways to go about analyzing this. So we start off with our tonic triad, passing seventh in the bass, and then we have F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A, which is our sixth chord, F sharp minor, and then we have C sharp, E, and A, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. Kind of an unusual progression, but all in all, really not too much to write home about, just a progression that we don't see all that often. Another passing seventh, this time in the tenor, and then we get D major, D, A, F sharp, and A, which is our four chord in the key of A major. And then we have a chromatic bass line. And if you're looking ahead, you know that the chord on the other side of this D sharp is kind of interesting. It's an E minor chord, and as far as justifying this harmony is concerned, it's not really functioning in a traditional fashion. There are, different things that could potentially be happening here. I'm going to go ahead and say that this D major chord is where we're moving to the key of E, and it's now functioning as our flat 7. I think that there are multiple ways that you could look at this. You could say that the modulation happens after the secondary dominant and treat this B major chord here like a secondary dominant. But to me, this is just such an atypical chord progression that I think you just have to be creative in terms of how you go about analyzing it. So this G is a passing tone, and then we go straight into B major, D sharp, F sharp, and B, so 5, 6, 7 going to 5. Sometimes we see the subtonic seventh used as a predominant because of its stability, but it's one of the lesser common chords to be seen in general. So it's when it gets used this way, it's just another comment on the fact that we're sort of doubling down here on the uncommon context that we see 7 being used. But all in all, it's fine so far. I think what's more interesting is the fact that we're going to cadence in the key of E major, and not only do we have a minor tonic chord here, but we also have mode mixture, right? We're flirting with Bach is flirting with the idea of E minor and E major coexisting with one another, because after our 5 chord, we progress to E minor, E, B, E, and G natural. So I think another outlook could be this idea of a mixolydian, the idea where taking the leading tone and flatting it, making it a G natural, would turn the 5 chord into a minor chord. But I think that outlook is largely I don't want to say incorrect, but I want to say it's harder to defend because of the D sharp tonicizing the E. I think we're definitely making a move to E. I feel like that's ideally what's happening here from an analytical standpoint. But it really is interesting. This G natural here has been harmonized with E rather than maybe with with like A7 and then moving to D major or something like that, which I feel is something that might be more typical of Bach, but Bach has definitely approached it in a unique fashion. Perhaps it's how this melody, or he's familiar with another harmonization of this melody, and that's how another composer treated it. But all in all, we are in the realm of E major for the rest of the section, so moving to E at this point might just be more of a gesture to comment on what's about to happen moving forward as well. So after our minor tonic triad, we have B, D sharp, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord in root position. A little delayed passing seventh here in the tenor, and then we cadence on E major, E, G sharp, B, and E. tonic triad. So mode mixture, whichever way you cut it. If you view this entire phrase being in the key of E minor, we end on a major tonic with that Picardy third. If you view this phrase being in the key of E major, we have a flat 7 chord here, or at least that's where I decided the modulation was to occur. To me, I don't know, just the way that the phrase sounded after listening to it over and over again, and this isn't the first time I've sat down and listened to this phrase or a particular harmonization that had these qualities, because I've looked at this particular melody in the past before. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where the modulation is happening, but I think the big takeaway is that there is a modulation that's happening here, and regardless of wherever you mark it, just make sure that the analysis lines up with how the chords would be based on your interpretation of the chord progression. In this case, I feel like the modulation's happening at the beginning of the chromatic bass line here. It's actually a chromatic bass line starting from C sharp now, I'm realizing, but this fragment right here is where I feel the progression to, or the modulation, I guess more specifically to the key of E is happening. It's also quite possible that we are in the key of E minor and Bach just modulates distant, and instead of cadencing in the key or cadencing on a minor triad, he cadences on a major triad, and that's the Picardy third. All in all, it's difficult to say. I'll actually just put a slash here and say maybe we're in the key of E minor as well. We're in the key of E. I think that that's the happy medium and the compromise regardless of whatever viewpoint you have. I think they're both equally valid. But we are going to continue in the key of E. In this case, it's going to be more of an E major sound, like the dominant of A, and that's going to be maintained until the end of the section, like I mentioned before. We have a perfect authentic cadence here at the end of the phrase, and we start off with another E major chord, E, E, G sharp, and B. No need to reanalyze. And then we have A, E, A, and C sharp. That's our 4 chord. Before we move to B, D sharp, G sharp, and B. Kind of an interesting chord here. I'm going to analyze it as 5 and say that this G sharp is an accented non-chord tone, but we could say that this was a 3-6 chord, and the main reason why I feel like this could be a 3-6 chord actually coincides with yesterday's video, which we had a progression of 4 going to 3-6, going to 4-6, which is exactly what's happening here. C sharp, E, and A, which is a pattern that if you've watched my videos in the past, you know that it's relatively common for Bach to do this pattern where he takes 2 similar chords, one inverted and one not, and then bridging the gap with stepwise motion with a chord that's a diatonic step below it. So a lot of the times we see 1-7-6, 1-6. That's definitely the most common one, but here we're seeing potentially 4-3-6, 4-6, and in fact I'm going to walk back my analysis and say that it is exactly what's happening, because it is what's happening on the beat, and the F sharp is going to be a passing 7th, but you could analyze this as 5 as well. I think that both of them are equally valid in this context. We see 4 go to 5 a lot. We see 5 go to 4-6 as sort of a substitute for a deceptive progression. Typically we see 6 afterwards, but 4-6 being very similar to 6 in terms of pitch content and what's going on the bass. They're more or less, they are interchangeable. So 3-6 versus 5, same difference. They're very similar to one another, but in this context, it's anyone's guess as to whether it's a 3-6 chord or a 5 chord. I'd say that I flipped to 3-6 just because the pattern, I think, makes a little bit more sense, but really it's a toss-up, and 6 of one, half dozen of another, as I've said in the past. So after 4-6, we move to kind of an interesting chord progression. We have an ascending thirds progression, B, C sharp, E, and G sharp, which is C sharp minor 7 over B, and in the key of E major, that is 6-4-2, not a chord we see very often. We would expect this to resolve to 2-6, which it actually does. So Bach, continuing on the train of the majority of his 4-2 chords, really resolving the way that we would expect them to, there being a pattern and a consistency across all of his music, or all of his chorales at least. We have A here, and we have F sharp here, leaving us with A, C sharp, E, and F sharp, which is F sharp minor 7 over A, 2-6-5, so the chord resolving the way we would expect. Doesn't necessarily have to be a 2-6-5 chord, but here we have a 2 chord and first inversion of some sort. We would expect this to go to some sort of 5 chord, but we don't quite get a 5 chord off the bat. We get an accessory to a 5 chord, which is B, B, E, and G sharp, which is 1-6-4, which is typically followed by a 5 chord, just like it is in this case, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. So B major and root position, we often see them contextualized alongside one another in cadential situations. That's why it's called the cadential 6-4, right? But yeah, afterwards we see our tonic triad E major, E, G sharp, B, and E. Next phrase, we have a half cadence in the key of A major, and I think we pretty much modulate straight away. In the key of A, our E chord is 5. It sort of realizes the progression back to the beginning with the loop that happens, or the repeat that happens. But moving into the B section, we have not a tonic triad in first inversion, but rather a 3 chord C sharp minor, C sharp, G sharp, C sharp, and E, which is a substitute for 1. It's a stable chord, consists of the majority of its pitch contents are the same as a 1 chord. It's just G sharp versus A. We also have a passing 7th here in the alto, and then 3 takes us to where it usually goes, which is 6 or some type of 4 chord. In this case, actually no, apologies, it does not take us to 6, it takes us to 4-6. That's what I was trying to say. Usually the bass movement is up a 5th, and that takes us to the 6th of the scale, but whether it's a 4-6 chord or a 6 chord is usually a toss-up. So in this case we have D major over F sharp, A, and D sharp, so that's 4-6. Then we have some passing tones in the lower voices here, kind of implying a bit of a 7 chord with the G sharp and the B going on, but with the D and the A, we don't really have an analyzable chord. It'd be like a diminished 9th chord, which is sort of beyond the vocabulary we would expect of Bach in this time. So it's more of a contrapuntal chord than it is, a harmony that's to be analyzed and put on the page. But just like with all 4-6 progressions that move to a tonic triad on the next beat, there's always the leading tone or some type of connecting tone between the 6 and the 1 of the scale. That's consistent across all of Bach's chorales. We have A, C sharp, A, and C sharp, 2 roots and 2/3 spelling, but still an A major chord. Another passing tone in the tenor, and then we have E, G sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord, E major, and that takes us to C sharp, E, A, and A. We might be tempted to call this a tonic triad. I'm going to call it 5-6 of 4, because even though we have an A major chord here with this G natural and passing here in the alto, I feel like there is a higher function to the chord. Like, yeah, our tonic is sort of happening here. We have an A major chord, but in the grander scheme of things, it's going to resolve to D major via this G natural, which makes the A major chord different than a typical tonic 7th chord, which is already kind of an atypical chord in Bach's vocabulary. We've only seen a handful of tonic 7 chords. But in this case, we do resolve to 4. D, F sharp, and A, D major. We have some passing tones in the upper voices here, which give us a 7 chord. We still have D's in the lower voices. Then we have D sharp and B, or sorry, G sharp. Did I say G sharp? I think I might have said D sharp. G sharp and B, which is G sharp diminished over D. The inversion doesn't really matter too much during chords that are subdivided. Just so happens that the bass didn't move, so we see it in inversion. Regardless, what matters is that we have 4 going to 7. It's probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of Bach. But we see a bunch of interesting chord combinations where Bach uses passing tones to change the context of the chord, while some of the other voices stay static. But 4 going to 7 seems to be a very common combination. But afterwards we get our tonic, C sharp, E, A, and C sharp. That's 1-6, A major over C sharp, passing tone in the bass, and then we have E major, E, G sharp, and B. It's our 5 chord, E major. Next phrase, we have a perfect authentic cadence at the end of it in the key of B minor, and I think we spend the entire time in B minor. I mean, we start off with an A sharp here on the next beat, I think you can call this a direct modulation if you wanted to, but I think it's kind of a happy coincidence that we have this E major chord that could also be contextualized as our 4, because if we look at G sharp going to A sharp going to B here in the alto, it looks like sort of this elided or connected melodic minor, which is cool. The fact that Bach is bridging the melodic minor across keys and across phrases is interesting from an analytical standpoint. So I'm going to call this E a common chord, and it moves to C sharp, E, A sharp, and C sharp, which is A sharp diminished over C sharp. That is our 7 chord in first inversion, A sharp diminished over C sharp. We move on to B minor, B, F sharp, B, and D, which is our tonic triad. B is a chord tone, A is a passing 7th, and then we move to kind of an interesting chord here. We have C sharp, B, G natural, and C. I suppose you can make the argument that this is a 2 chord or a 2-7 chord like C sharp, minor 7, flat 5, but we don't have the minor part of the minor 7 because there's no E in here. But I think this B is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and in turn it sort of creates a similar situation where we have A sharp fully diminished 7th, A sharp, C sharp, and G natural. It's over C sharp, so it'd be 7, 6, 5. But we don't have the diminished part of the fully diminished 7th in the sense that there's no E natural in this chord, so it's a toss-up here, but I feel like because this is part of a greater 1-7-6-1-6 progression, D, B, F sharp, and B, I feel like this probably makes a little bit more sense from my experience having analyzed Bach in the past and seeing this pattern pop up as frequently as it does. We then have G, B, E, and B happening in passing here, this G being an accented non-chord tone along with this E, which is sort of like a passing 4-6 chord that takes us to 5, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A sharp, which is F sharp major in root position, and then we end the phrase with B minor, B, D, F sharp, and B. Tonic triad, root position, B minor. Moving on to the next phrase, we have a half cadence in the key of A major, and if I'm not mistaken, we spend the rest of our time in the B section in the key of A major. So, yeah, no more modulations from this point. We actually have no chromaticism from what I can see here, just scanning the page quickly. Yeah, I don't see any chromatic tones, so we stay in A pretty much for the rest of the chorale. I do think this B is a common chord, and similar to how we started the previous phrase, we're going to start off with a 3 chord, so I feel like this, sorry, I wrote B minor because I was thinking about a B minor chord. In the key of A major, this is a 2 chord, and then we're going to move to 3, so some adjacent harmony here. C sharp, G sharp, E, and E. C sharp minor is our 3 chord in the key of A major. 3 is going to take us to F sharp, A, C sharp, and A. Kind of like the mistake I made earlier. It's not taking us to 4-6 this time, it's taking us to 6, but the chords are more or less interchangeable because they have similar bass content and similar pitch content as well. 6 is going to take us to E7, E, G sharp, D, and B, which is our dominant. Passing 7th in the bass, that's a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and we have a passing tone in the tenor before we go to C sharp, E, E, and C sharp. Kind of an interesting chord progression here. We would sort of expect like a rootless 1-6 chord here for sure, but turns out to be like another 3 chord perhaps, because there's no A in this chord. But I feel like, I don't know, 3 is sort of being a substitute for 1 in this case. They're theoretically interchangeable, but we don't often see them used as substitutions for one another. But after 3, we go to B, D, F sharp, and B. You could make the argument this is a 2 chord, but I think this 3 chord being a substitute for 1-6, it makes a little bit more sense for this G sharp to be our chord tone. And we've seen this pattern before, 1-7-6, 1 6, or in this case it would be 1 6 7 6 to 1 A, C sharp, A, and E. 3. It's like it's pretty much operating as a rootless triad or tonic triad in first inversion because of the pattern, but this is the second time that we're seeing a bit of an altered pattern where one of the chords is compromised. It's not seen in the exact spelled context that we would expect. We have some passing tones in the lower voices here, and then we get C sharp, E, A, and D. I still think a tonic triad is what's being implied here, so 1 6, and then as a passing chord we have D, we have F sharp, we have A, and we have C sharp, which is like a 4-7 chord just before we get to 5, E, G sharp, E, and B. And then we're going to close out the chorale with our last phrase. We have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A. I think this is the first perfect authentic cadence we get in the key of the tonic in this entire chorale, which is pretty interesting. And then it makes sense for the last phrase to be in the key of the overall tonic. After 5 we get a bit of a transitive progression. It does not go to 1 like we would expect, or 6 or 3. It goes to 2, B, F sharp, and D, B minor in root position. Then we get some more interesting chords here. We go another transitive progression where we go to 6, F sharp, A, and C sharp, which is F sharp minor in root position. And that takes us not really to the location that we would expect, but if you look sort of at the big picture, it makes sense. We have G sharp, we have E, we have another G sharp, and we have C sharp, and that's a 3 chord, C sharp minor over G sharp. It happens to be in second inversion. It's a passing chord, but inversions I don't feel are super important when analyzing subdivided chord progressions. It's more the root of the chord that matters more. And this takes us to F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, D, F sharp, and B, which is B minor 7 over A, 2 4 2. Kind of an interesting progression here, but up until this 3 chord we have a cycle of ascending fifths progression, right? Typically we would expect to see the progression from right to left, 3 6 2 5, and then we would eventually get to 1, but here we see 5 2 6 3, and then it takes us to 2, 3 sort of serving as a buffer, not even really a necessary buffer in the sense that I've used the word in the past, where the chord separates 2 similarly functioning chords. Typically we would expect 6 to go to 2. But here, because 2 is in third inversion, and we have this passing tone here, I feel like it's more so, I don't know, this 3 is more just functioning as a passing chord, and really the big picture is 6 going to 2 here. But after 2 4 2, we would expect this to resolve to 5 6, which it does. G sharp, B, E, and E, which is E major over G sharp. E is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have A, C sharp, F sharp, and E, which is F sharp minor 7 over A. That's 6 6 5, kind of an interesting chord. We don't see it all that often. We've seen 2 6 7 chords in unusual inversions. A lot of times we just see 6 in root position. But when we see it inverted, I don't know, it just seems a little interesting to me. But then we have some passing tones. One of them is delayed. We have D, we have G sharp, we have D, and we have A. Another one of these sort of like diminished ninth chords that's not going to make it onto the page, but it's sort of like a passing chord between the 6 chord and the 1 chord. We've seen this progression at the beginning of the chorale, kind of an unusual one. But here we have A, E, A, and C sharp, which is our tonic, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the melody here before we get F sharp, E, A, and A. A bit of an ambiguous chord here. I think you can make the argument that that is another 6-7 chord, but I think actually the big picture is that there might be a double accented non-chord tone thing going on here. We have a 7-6 suspension over the bass, and with that same logic that would make this A. Well, A is not a non-chord tone, but we're looking for this B as our chord tone here, which would make this F sharp, D, A, and B, which is B minor 7 over F sharp, which is 2 4 3. and we would expect this to potentially go to some type of a tonic triad, or sorry, not a tonic triad, a dominant triad, which it does in one sense. We have E, C sharp, A in C sharp, which is 1-6-4, and as we touched on earlier, 1-6-4 is often an accessory to 5, but in somewhat of an unusual fashion, we have an interrupted 1-6-5 or 1-6-4 to 5 progression. We have this D, and we have this F sharp here, which leaves us with a D major 7 chord, D, F sharp, A, and C sharp, which is 4-7. We've seen 1-4 in this subdivided fashion earlier, so maybe this is harkening back to that, even though it's contextualized a bit differently. It's in a different key, and it's just different spellings. But after 4-7, we have 5, E, B, G sharp, and B. It's E major in root position. And we saw an interrupted 1-6-4-5 progression yesterday. And I mark it with a hashed or a dotted line just to separate it from a regular bracket where the chords are adjacent to one another. E is a chord tone, D is a passing seventh, and then we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, E, and A. Tonic triad, root position. And that is today's analysis. Lots of interesting chord progressions in this one. 4-3-6-4-6 is pretty cool. The opening chord progression, not really too much to write home about, but it's a chord progression that definitely raises some eyebrows in terms of, or brings into question how common the chord progressions are. 4-6, this cycle of falling or ascending fifths, or falling fourths, I guess. 5-2-6-3, kind of interesting. Definitely not what we would expect. But all in all, also starting two different phrases with the 3 chord is definitely unusual as well. But historically speaking, this chorale has been one of the more difficult to analyze, and have definitely subverts some expectations with the chords that Bach chooses in place of what we would expect. But other than that, mode mixture at the beginning, obviously can't neglect to mention that. Are we in E minor? Are we in E major? Doesn't really matter. And the interrupted 1-6-4 at the end, definitely not as apparent as the interrupted 1-6-4 to 5 progression we saw in yesterday's episode. Definitely check out episode 339. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about this particular chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.